Welcome, my weary traveller, to a serene journey through the annals of time. As the day's burdens fade and your eyelids grow heavy, we embark on a voyage to bygone eras. Imagine valiant knights, towering castles, and majestic cathedrals reaching for the heavens. Yet beyond these romanticized visions lie the harsh realities of life in the Middle Ages, where existence was often harsh, brutish, and short. Before we delve into these captivating yet challenging times, I invite you to pause and share your location and the time of day you're seeking respite in our humble historical narrative. Are you nestled in Stockholm as the midnight sun dips below the horizon? Perhaps you're winding down in Winchester after a delightful afternoon tea. Or maybe you're rising with the rosy finger dawn in Delhi, preparing to face the day ahead. Wherever you may be, know that you are most welcome here. If you find yourself enchanted by our quiet exploration of history's pages, consider subscribing to ensure you don't miss future installments designed to enlighten and lull you into peaceful slumber. Now, let us set the stage for our tale. Picture, if you will, a typical medieval European town, a jumble of half-timbered houses huddled together within sturdy stone walls. Smoke billows from chimneys as the inhabitants engage in their daily routines. The blacksmith hammers away at his forge, the baker slides crusty loaves into a clay oven, and the weaver deftly plies her loom with nimble fingers. Church bells toll the hours while children dart through narrow, muddy streets. At first glance, it all appears rather quaint and cozy. However, life in the Middle Ages was rarely a gentle idyll. Squalor, ignorance, pestilence, and violence were unfortunate realities for both the wealthy and the impoverished. The townspeople endured an unending series of hardships. They faced a scarcity of food, spoiled and rotten. Sanitation was poor, and rampant crime was rampant. Summers were scorching, and winters were crushing and deadly, with the constant threat of death from accidents, warfare, or horrific diseases. Of course, some parts of medieval society were even more wretched than others, veritable hellscapes where only the strongest, luckiest, or most ruthless could hope to survive. In the deepest pits of suffering, we find decrepit prisons with their broken captives. Putrid plague hospitals overflowed with the doomed and dying. Desolate monasteries where holy men waged solitary battles against doubt and despair. As we drift off into restful reverie, we shall visit some of these forsaken places and meet a few of the ill-starred souls who called them home. We will walk a mile in their worn, lice-ridden shoes and gain a deeper understanding of their hardships, their heartaches, and their small yet hard-won joys. So come, let us hide to bed and immerse ourselves in the vivid, unvarnished, often harsh truth of living and dying in the Middle Ages. Part 1. Cities and Towns. Our first stop is London in the year of our Lord 1272, a teeming Antill of 80,000 souls packed into a labyrinth of crooked lanes and rickety wooden tenements. The air hung heavy with the stench of emptied chamber pots rotting awful and thick, greasy smoke from untold cook fires and workshops. Rivers of waste oozed down open gutters to pull in noxious bogs that festered with flies. Meanwhile, livestock and loose dogs roamed freely, further fouling the filthy streets. For the common folk, home was a ramshackle affair, a one- or two-room hovel with low ceilings, glassless windows, and a packed dirt floor strewn with rushes. Here, an entire family had to eat, sleep, and work in suffocating proximity to scant water, warmth, or ventilation. Tattered clothing and bedding swarmed with fleas and lice. Clawing wood smoke stung the eyes, but it failed to fully mask the unwashed bodies. If this wasn't misery enough, such close quarters served as an incubator for contagion. From mundane ailments like measles and influenza to the periodic ravages of leprosy and plague, even a simple scratch could turn deadly due to poor hygiene. Untreated sewage poisoned wells and polluted the air, unleashing waves of dysentery and cholera. Those who didn't succumb to disease risked perishing in one of the many fires that regularly ravaged timber-built blocks. Consider the plight of Will Fletcher, a humble bower and loving family man. Each day he rose before dawn to toil in the cramped front room, crafting bows of UW and ash amidst heaps of wood shavings and the pungent stench of rendered animal glue. His wife Joan and their 3 children shared the tiny back room, which also served as the kitchen. Meals were cooked over an open hearth, filling the space with smoke that seeped into the rough sheets and mildewed straw mattress. Little Jack, the youngest, had a hacking cough that kept the family awake and raised the spectre of consumption, while his sisters sniffled and scratched at weeping pox-laden sores. Will yearned for a fine stone house on a quieter street, but his meagre earnings barely covered rent and food for his brood. He also feared drawing the attention of the ruthless tax collector or running afoul of the guild. So he soldiered on, finding his few joys in a stolen embrace with Joan or a brief twilight walk along the twinkling Thames. A threadbare existence, to be sure, but still preferable to the squalid misery of London's vilest quarters, where even these slim comforts were but a dream. As we've seen, life in medieval cities and towns was often nasty, brutish, and short. However, for those seeking to escape the squalor and strife, options were limited. Some fled to remote monasteries, seeking solace in a life of quiet contemplation and prayer. Imagine you are a weary traveler approaching one such monastery perched precariously on a wind-swept cliff. As you draw closer, the old stone walls, pitted and worn by centuries of harsh weather, come into view. A few black-robed monks toil silently in the meager garden plots, struggling to make ends meet from the thin, rocky soil. At the gate, you are greeted by the abbot, a stern-looking man with a heavily lined face and piercing eyes. He extends his hand in hospitality, as per the rule of St. Benedict, but there's a palpable lack of warmth in his words. Life here revolves around discipline, deprivation, and duty rather than comfort or companionship. The abbot leads you into the heart of the monastery, a world of cold stone, dark corridors, and flickering candles. Solemn plain echoes hauntingly through the cavernous chapel as the monks gather for vespers. In the refectory, you are served a meager meal of thin gruel and hard bread in complete silence. Even idle chatter is strictly forbidden. As the sun sets over the bleak cliffs and the sea mist rolls in, you retire to the guest house, a dank cell with a straw pallet for a bed. Shivering in the gloom, you marvel at the fortitude required to endure such an austere existence day after day, year after year. What conviction or desperation could compel someone to such self-denial? One man who might know is Brother Adelmo, the oldest monk in the abbey at nearly 70 winters. His back is bent from decades of labor in the scriptorium, meticulously copying and illuminating manuscripts. His eyes are rheumy and his hands gunneled, but his mind remains sharp as a well-honed quill. As you sit with him in a rare moment of rest, Adelmo recounts his journey to the monastery as a young man fleeing a broken heart and a life of sin. He yearned for peace and purpose in serving God. However, as the decades slowly passed in a blur of prayers, chores, and solitude, doubts crept in. Had he truly been called to this life, or was he simply running from his past? Now, with the end of his earthly existence looming, Adelmo grapples with unsettling questions that disturb his meditations. Did he squander the precious gift of life within these confining walls? Will the sacrifices and sufferings he endured for the glory of God be sufficient to secure his place in heaven? The old monk gazed deeply, the sound of his breath mingling with the whistling wind outside. As you bid Adelmo farewell and retire for the night, his words linger in your mind. A life of contemplation and devotion may draw one closer to the divine, but the hardships and isolation of places like this remote monastery also carried their own kind of quiet anguish. Even those who dedicated themselves to a higher calling were not immune to loneliness, doubt, and regret. Sleep eludes you as you ponder the paradox of monastic life, a refuge from the world that could also become a prison of its own making. As your eyes finally close and the sound of distant waves lulls you to slumber, you dream of the nameless scribes like Adelmo hunched over parchment by flickering candlelight through the centuries. Theirs was a cloistered existence we can scarcely imagine today, yet their diligence and faith ensured the survival of knowledge through the darkest of ages. However, monasteries, as remote and restrictive as they could be, were far from the only challenging frontiers of the medieval world. For those dwelling in borderlands contested by rival kingdoms, life was a daily struggle for survival in the shadow of constant conflict. Imagine a scene in the bleak marches of northern England, early in the 12th century. The morning fog clings low and chilly over muddy fields as a haggard old woman emerges from a half-clopsed hovel. She is Morwenna, a widow of nearly 60 winters who has witnessed more than her share of hardship and sorrow. Moana's eyes slowly survey what remains of her village, a mere handful of ramshackle huts clustered around the charred skeleton of a tiny chapel. The place never had a name. It was too small and insignificant to warrant one. Now, after the last attack by Scottish raiders, it barely qualifies as a hamlet at all. Picking her way through the churning mud and charred debris, Morena makes her way to the meager garden plot behind her hut. It's all that stands between her and starvation. As she bends down to pull a few withered turnips from the hard ground, her mind drifts back to the fateful night a mere moon ago. She recalls the shouts of alarm, the pounding of hooves, and the flickering of torches in the darkness. The raiders arrived swiftly and mercilessly, throwing burning brands onto the thatch roofs and driving off the few scrawny sheep and cattle. Moana thinks of poor Edric the Reeve, who was cut down in a futile attempt to raise a defense. His body still lies where it fell, hacked and bloated by the ruined chapel. Most of the survivors fled in the chaos, seeking refuge in the relative safety of the walled town, a day's walk to the south. However, Moana remains rooted to this miserable scrap of land, like one of her stubbornly tenacious turnips. Where else could she go? This hovel has been her home for 4 decades. Ever since she arrived as a young bride to raise a family and make a living on the unforgiving frontier, she endured the bitter years after her husband was conscripted and never returned from some nameless skirmish to the north. She braved the winter, her youngest son succumbing to the bloody flux, and she persevered even as most of her neighbors abandoned their homes and sought better prospects elsewhere. This land, though harsh, is the only home Morena has ever known. So here she remains, a lonely old woman struggling to make a meager living from an unyielding earth, constantly teetering on the edge of survival and oblivion. As she straightens up painfully, clutching her few precious turnips, Moana gazes towards the distant horizon. She can only hope that the raiders, the plague, or starvation will hold off long enough for her to witness another spring. Such was the precarious existence of so many in these lawless and unforgiving borderlands of medieval Europe. In the subsequent scene, we embark on a perilous journey to the very fringes of the known medieval world, venturing into the remote and poorly supplied colonial outpost. Brace yourself for a bleak voyage across stormy seas, a destination promising untold suffering and despair for even the most resilient souls. Medieval castles were notorious for their vile and wretched dungeons, the lowest levels of an already rigidly hierarchical society. Damp, dark, and claustrophobic, these subterranean chambers were reserved for the most reviled members of the community, traitors, heretics, debtors, and petty criminals who had found themselves on the wrong side of the local lord's justice. Life in these dank holes was a daily struggle against hunger, disease, and despair. The stale air was rife with the stench of mold, rotting straw, and human waste, while vermin scurried in the shadows, feeding on scraps and occasionally the inmates themselves. The only light that seeped in through tiny barred windows, if there were any, was insufficient to combat the absolute darkness of the night. Typical dungeons were little more than stone vaults, divided into cramped cells by rusting iron gates or heavy wooden doors. Manacles bolted to the walls restrained the most dangerous or troublesome prisoners. Furniture was scarce, perhaps a fated pile of straw on the floor serving as a makeshift bed. The jailers were as cold and unyielding as the walls themselves, quick to wield the lash or withhold rations for the slightest provocation. It is difficult to imagine the anguish and alienation endured by the occupants of these dismal oots. Consider the story of Thomas, a young peasant farmer wrongfully accused of poaching by a merciless nobleman. Ripped from the arms of his wife and infant son, Thomas was dragged in chains to the bowels of the castle, where he was thrown into a cramped cell already occupied by 2 half-starved wretches. As the heavy door slammed shut, plunging him into suffocating darkness, the grim reality of his predicament began to sink in. The days stretched into weeks, each one blending into the next, in an endless cycle of gnawing hunger, shivering cold and fitful sleep on the damp stone floor. His cellmates, broken and emaciated, exchanged few words, having long since exhausted their tales of misery and misfortune. Deprived of all human comforts and dignity, Thomas felt his mind begin to fray at the edges. He wept for his family, praying they would somehow find a way to survive without him. He cursed the nobleman who had condemned him, fantasizing about bloody revenge even as he grew weaker by the day. The worst was the knowledge that he would likely perish here in this filthy hole, never again to see the sun or breathe fresh air, his loved ones never knowing his fate. As the faint sounds of the castle above filtered through the stone, the clatter of dishes, snippets of muffled conversations, and even the occasional snatch of music, Thomas couldn't help but marvel at the cruel capriciousness of life. How thin the line was between the lords and ladies in their fine silken furs and the miserable wretches rotting just beneath their feet. In the dungeon, stripped of all pretense, the stark inequality of the age was laid bare. Perhaps most soul-crushing of all was the sheer hopelessness of the prisoners' plight. With no recourse to appeal their sentence and no allies to plead their case, they could only pray for a miracle or more likely an end to their suffering. Many lost their minds, raving in the darkness at phantoms and gibbering until merciful death claimed them. Others simply wasted away, their emaciated corpses lying for days before the guards bothered to drag them out. These scenes of misery and despair played out in castle dungeons across medieval Europe, from the Tower of London to the Oulettes of France and the Trachy prison in Lithuania. While the specifics varied from place to place, the overarching cruelty and coldness were always the same, a reflection of the harshness and brutality of the era. For those who entered these dreadful dungeons, hope and humanity remained firmly shut outside. Of course, dungeons were not solely the domain of castles and keeps. Many medieval cities and towns had their own prisons and jails, some hidden beneath government buildings or towering walls. These municipal dungeons could be every bit as dreadful as their castle counterparts, overcrowded, underlit dens of appalling squalor. One particularly infamous dungeon was the Bastille in Paris, a looming fortress on the edge of the city that became a symbol of royal cruelty and excess. Its windowless cells, some of which flooded with each rainfall, crammed in political dissidents, freethinkers, and those who had simply offended the increasingly volatile French monarchy. Voltaire, the renowned Enlightenment writer, spent nearly a year confined in the Bastille under squalid conditions. Although his social status afforded him better treatment than the average prisoner, he still endured drafty, vermin-infested quarters and the constant cries of tormented inmates. The experience left an indelible mark, and Voltaire's later writings seethed with contempt for the callous tyranny of French royal justice. In England, the Fleet prison became notorious for its horrendous conditions and systematic corruption. Ostensibly a debtor's prison, the Fleet was a filthy, decrepit labyrinth where inmates were shaken down for every penny by predatory wardens and subjected to all manner of abuse and extortion. For those who lacked the means to pay exorbitant fees for food, bedding, and other basic needs, life in the prison could be worse than death. The story of Jacob Mendes Solomon, an 18th-century stockbroker who found himself imprisoned in the Fleet over a miscalculated debt, illustrates the everyday miseries faced by inmates. Unable to muster the arbitrary sums demanded by the warden for food and a decent cell, Solomon wasted away in the common side of the castle, a hellscape of open sewers, rampant disease, and unremitting hunger. Surviving on a few mouldy scraps smuggled to him by a kindly rabbi, his health rapidly deteriorated. After several years, his family finally secured his release, and he emerged as an emaciated, broken shell of a man, his once successful career in tatters. This serves as a stark reminder of the unimaginable suffering and despair that often plagued the dungeons of the Middle Ages, whether in castles, keeps, or municipal jails. These places imprisoned the body and crushed the spirit, stripping away dignity and sometimes sanity. Yet it's remarkable that any emerged from these black pits at all, a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. For those listening safely from the cocoon of a warm bed, it can be difficult to comprehend the depth of misery endured by countless souls condemned to waste away in medieval dungeons. As you drift off tonight, perhaps spare a thought for them, the forgotten, the forsaken, those who suffered in dark and filthy cells, clinging to the barest shreds of hope and humanity. Their struggles and sorrows may be lost to time, but they need not be lost to memory. By learning their stories and pondering their plight, we keep a small candle burning for them in the present. In doing so, we reaffirm the immense progress we've made and remind ourselves of the work still to be done in advancing human rights and dignity for all. With that, I bid you good night and sweet dreams. May your sleep be restful and your waking hours filled with gratitude and purpose. Until next time, this is your faithful history guide signing off. As we've seen, even the grandest medieval castles could be cold, dark, and uncomfortable places to live. However, at least within those high walls, residents had a measure of security and stability. Not so for the people confined to the castle dungeons. These dank and filthy cells were reserved for the most despised prisoners, including debtors, thieves, political rivals, and anyone who caught the attention of the local lord. Escape was virtually impossible. The thick stone walls were designed to keep prisoners confined and block out any natural light. Iron bars, heavy wooden doors, and vigilant guards ensured that those who entered the dungeon rarely left, except perhaps for a brief trip to the gallows. Modern archaeologists discovered skeletons that told a grim story of the prisoners' hardships. Malnutrition was rampant, evident from bone deformities and tooth decay. Unhealed fractures indicated frequent beatings by jailers. Journals from the time described prisoners as wretched and miserable creatures, clad in rags and covered in sores. Their spirits were utterly broken by the dehumanizing conditions. In some castles, the dungeon was little more than a deep pit or ooze where prisoners were lowered on a rope and left to starve in the dark. These unfortunate souls might be confined alongside the rotting corpses of previous victims, the very definition of a living nightmare. Other dungeons featured torture chambers, where suspected traitors or blasphemers were subjected to brutal interrogations using devices like the rack, the Iron Maiden, or the Judas cradle under the sadistic gaze of professional torturers. One account from 1385 recounts the story of a French knight named Jean de Carouge, who was imprisoned by his rival, Jacques Rey, in the dungeons of a small castle in Normandy. For weeks he was shackled to the walls in heavy irons, subsisting on meager rations of stale bread and fetid water. Filthy rats as big as cats ignored his legs in the darkness. According to the Chronicle, when carriages were finally brought before his captor, he resembled a miserable sack of bones, scarcely recognizable as a man. Only his burning desire for vengeance sustained him. In a shocking turn of events, Cares managed to escape his captivity just in time to challenge Rey to a judicial duel. Before a crowd, he stabbed his former jailer to death, washing away the stain on his honor. Most prisoners could only dream of such vindication. Their bleak and all too short lives ended in squalor, forgotten in some urn hole. Perhaps the most famous dungeon prisoner of the Middle Ages was a mysterious figure known only as the Man in the Iron Mask. According to legend, this unidentified man was arrested in 1669 under orders from King Louis XIV of France himself. The terrible crime he committed has been lost to history. Some speculate he was the king's disgraced older brother, or perhaps the illegitimate child of a royal mistress. For reasons unknown, it was decreed that his identity should never be revealed. Thus, this enigmatic prisoner spent over 3 decades confined in the dungeons of several French castles, always under heavy guard. Most bizarrely, he was forced to wear an iron mask at all times, even while eating or sleeping, to conceal his face from anyone he encountered. He was never referred to by name, only as prisoner number 64,389,000. While the true story may never be known, the mythic tale of the Man in the Iron Mask came to symbolize the mystery, dread, and capricious cruelty of medieval dungeons in the public imagination. Echoes of his story reverberated through the works of Voltaire and Alexandre Dumas. For centuries, the silent screams and strangled moans of dungeon prisoners haunted the thick castle walls like vengeful wraiths fading into legend. Until modern times, these desperate voices from the past remained in those long-abandoned vaults of stone and iron, their mute testimony to the darkest recesses of the medieval world. However bleak castle dungeons undoubtedly were, they were sadly just one of many terrible places a medieval peasant or foot soldier might find themselves trapped, hungry and hopeless. When 2 medieval lords clashed over territory, wealth or pride, the lowest in society bore the brunt of the suffering. In a typical siege, an invading army encircled their rival's castle, effectively camping outside its walls until the enemy surrendered or starvation claimed the lives of those inside. To protect themselves and block aid or supplies, the besieging force constructed crude fortifications. Catapults and siege towers were assembled to assault the high walls from a distance, while tunnels were dug to undermine the fortifications. This grim situation could persist for months or even years, with both sides growing increasingly desperate. The misery of daily life in these siege camps was unimaginable. Foraging and pillaging the surrounding countryside could only sustain the invaders for so long, and supply lines were notoriously unreliable. Food shortages and famine loomed as constant threats. With so many soldiers crammed into a confined space alongside animals, refuse, and the dead, disease spread rapidly. Descent, cholera, and typhus decimated young warriors in their prime, rotting them from the inside out. Medieval army physicians had limited options, resorting to leeches and prayers. An anonymous 14th-century poem vividly captured the wretched scene in the siege camp. Life in the camp was hell, knee-deep in filth and vomit. Pale, wasting troops with sunken eyes lived. Their pale, sloughing skin was a testament to their suffering, attracting flies. Few sieges were as prolonged or as dreadful as the infamous siege of Candia on the island of Crete, which dragged on for an astonishing 21 years, from 1648 to 1669. The Ottoman Empire aimed to capture the strategic port city, a valuable Venetian outpost in the eastern Mediterranean. The walled settlement endured near constant bombardment as the Ottomans gradually strangled it into submission. Over 70,000 Ottomans and nearly 40,000 Venetians ultimately lost their lives in this conflict. Many perished due to starvation or illness rather than combat. Candia, the modern-day Heraklion, finally succumbed to the Ottomans after a grueling siege that spanned nearly 3 years. The city was reduced to rubble, and its civilian survivors, starving and scarred, stumbled from the gates like walking ghosts. In many ways, the siege of Candia foreshadowed the relentless attrition and astronomical death tolls of modern trench warfare. For the lowly soldiers on the front lines of a medieval siege, there was little hope of glory or riches. Only the gnawing hunger, creeping disease, and the numbing monotony of camp life punctuated by occasional spasms of violence and mass death. Even if they survived, they might return home traumatized, crippled, or disfigured with little to show for their suffering. The unimaginable hardships of siege warfare left an indelible mark on the popular memory of the Middle Ages. In 1874, nearly 2 centuries after the last great siege of the period, the Russian composer Modest Mussorgsky composed his pictures at an exhibition. The thundering and dissonant 10th movement, titled The Hut on Hen's Legs Baraga, was directly inspired by the legend of an evil witch who feasted on the souls of doomed medieval soldiers. While fairy tales may be filled with gallant knights and chivalrous heroes, the reality for the majority of medieval soldiers was as dark and hellish as the deepest dungeon. The grim futility of their sacrifice has largely been erased from our collective understanding of the Middle Ages. However, their bleak struggle deserves remembrance. And yet, my weary travelers, even the wretched common soldier palled in comparison to the very lowest of the low in medieval society. The serfs and slaves whose bondage and backbreaking labor made such ceaseless warfare possible in the first place, chained by the invisible shackles of the feudal system. Here is the continuation of the bedtime history script. The worst places to live during medieval times. Imagine gazing out across an isolated frontier outpost. As the sun descends slowly over the horizon, a chilling wind sweeps across the barren hills, carrying with it the faint aroma of smoke from distant settlements. This is life on the fringes of the medieval world, a harsh, solitary, and often short existence. Many poor souls were forced to man the watchtowers and forts far removed from the relative comforts and security of the cities and towns. Out here on the borderlands between rival kingdoms or the edge of civilization itself, one was at the mercy of not only the unforgiving elements, but also the cruelty and capriciousness of mankind. Consider the tale of Alrich, a battle-scarred mercenary who has witnessed more than his share of violence and tragedy. As a young man, he was conscripted into the army of a petty lord, more of a brigand than any true nobility. For years he fought for this brute, raiding villages and burning crops. all while witnessing his comrades fall in the name of greed and ambition. But what choice did he have? It was the soldier's life, or the beggar's bowl. Now, with his best years behind him, Alrich finds himself stationed in a crumbling fort. His task is to keep watch for the very same raiders and bandits he once rode with. The irony is not lost on him as he stares out across the desolate hills, searching for any sign of trouble. But he takes his duties seriously, for he knows all too well the suffering that can be unleashed upon the innocent. Life here on the borderlands is a far cry from the pageantry and glory promised to young men who take up the sword and shield. The days are long, the rations meager, and the company rough. Alrich has seen more than one fresh-faced recruit filled with dreams of valor and riches, broken by the grim reality of this posting. Some desert, fleeing into the night, never to be seen again. Others simply withdraw into themselves, their eyes haunted by the things they've witnessed. For Alrich, there is a certain grim camaraderie among the men he serves with. They are all survivors in their own unique way, clinging to the remnants of their humanity. In the evenings, huddled around the meager fire, they share stories of past battles and fallen comrades. Their laughter tinged with the gallows humor of those who live each day knowing it could be their last, adds a touch of levity to the somber atmosphere. Amidst the bleakness, there are moments of surprising beauty and grace. The morning mist clings to the hillsides, shrouding the land in an ethereal glow. The unexpected kindness of a local herder, offering a portion of his meager provisions to the weary soldiers, brings a glimmer of hope. The haunting strains of a minstrel's lute drifting up from the valley below serve as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit endures. However, these moments are fleeting, and the harsh realities of life on the borderlands always reassert themselves. Constant raids and skirmishes, the clash of steel on steel, and the cries of the wounded and dying are a constant reminder of the dangers that lurk. The tedium of endless watchers staring out into the darkness, always alert for the first signs of danger, adds to the sense of isolation. And there is the gnawing knowledge that one misstep, one moment of inattention, could mean the difference between life and death. For Alrich, this life has taken its toll. His body bears the scars of 100 battles, and his mind is burdened with countless horrors witnessed. He knows that he will likely meet his end out here, on some nameless patch of blood-soaked earth, far from the home and family he barely remembers. Despite the hardships, he soldiers on for duty, honor, and the slim hope that someday, somehow, he will find a measure of peace. As the last light of the day fades and the stars begin to emerge, Alrich clambers up to his post atop the weathered ramparts. Pulling his cloak tight against the night chill, he settles in for another long watch. His eyes scan the horizon, searching for any sign of movement, while his ears strain for the telltale sounds of an approaching enemy. It's a lonely vigil, but one he knows he must keep. For those residing on the fringes of the known world, life was fraught with uncertainty and peril. Each dawn brought with it the promise of danger and the chance to witness another sunset. The medieval borderlands were not for the faint of heart. They demanded a unique blend of resilience and resignation to endure such an existence. Yet for men like Alrich, it was the only life they knew. They were the vigilant sentinels on the walls, the steadfast guardians in the night, the unsung heroes who stood between civilization and the chaos that threatened to engulf it. As you drift off to sleep in your modern bed, safe and warm, spare a thought for those like Alrich, the forgotten souls who manned the ramparts and traversed the desolate roads of the medieval frontier. Their struggles, their sacrifices, their acts of courage and compassion were the threads that wove the tapestry of our shared history. By honoring their memory, we preserved the flame of human resilience that had carried us through the darkest of times and into the light of a new day. However, the medieval world was not the only place where life was harsh and unforgiving. For those who ventured into the vastness of the seas, seeking fortune or adventure in distant lands, an even more perilous existence awaited. The journey to the farthest reaches of the known world was arduous and fraught with danger. Those who survived to reach the colonies often found that the reality of life there was far removed from the promises of riches and glory. Imagine you're a young man named John, born into a modest family in the bustling port city of Bristol. Throughout your life, you've been captivated by tales of the New World. a land of boundless opportunity where a man could rise above his station and achieve greatness. Entranced by these stories, you sign on as a laborer with a company of settlers bound for the distant shores of the Americas. The voyage is nothing short of hellish. For weeks on end, you're crammed into the dark, damp hold of the ship, surrounded by the stench of unwashed bodies and the groans of the seasick. The food is meager and rotten, the water brackish and foul. Many of your fellow passengers succumb to disease or despair, their bodies unceremoniously consigned to the depths. By the time you finally make landfall, you're a shadow of your former self, weakened by hunger and illness. But the true ordeal is only beginning. The colony you find yourself in is a far cry from the paradise you were promised. It's little more than a collection of ramshackle huts surrounded by a hostile wilderness. The indigenous people, far from welcoming the newcomers, view them with suspicion and hostility, and with good reason. The colonists often resort to violence and theft to sustain themselves. Life in the colony is a constant struggle against the elements, disease, and desperation. The work is backbreaking, the conditions squalid. Many of the settlers, unprepared for the rigors of this new life, quickly succumb to malnutrition, exhaustion, or the myriad illnesses that stalk the camp. You watch as your comrades die off one by one, their dreams of riches and glory shattered on the unforgiving shores of this new world. And yet, even in the midst of such misery, there are those who prosper. The leaders of the colony, the men who brought you here with their grandiose visions, seem to thrive on the suffering of others. They live in relative comfort, their huts larger and better provisioned, while the rest toil and starve. They enforce their rule with an iron fist, meting out harsh punishments for the slightest infractions. In this lawless place, their word is the only law for you, John. Each day is a test of endurance and will. You rise with the sun to tend the meager crops, your hands blistered and bleeding from the unaccustomed labor. You forage in the woods for anything edible to supplement the dwindling rations, always vigilant for the sound of hostile tribesmen or prowling predators. Huddled in your drafty shack at night, you dream of home, the bustling streets of Bristol, the warmth of your mother's hearth, the companionship of friends and family. These memories seem distant now, fading with each passing day. Despite the hardships, you persevere. There's a stubborn streak in you, a refusal to surrender or despair. You find solace in the small moments of beauty and grace that punctuate the bleakness, the way morning mist clings to trees, the unexpected kindness of a fellow settler sharing their meager rations, the haunting strains of a song from home sung softly around the evening fire. These moments remind you of your humanity and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. As weeks turn into months and months into years, you find yourself changed by this place and this life. Your hands are calloused, your skin weathered by sun and wind. You've learned to hunt and trap, navigate dense forests, and read the signs of the seasons. Though you still dream of home, a part of you has grown attached to this wild, untamed land, to the freedom and challenges it represents. For better or worse, this is your life now. You're a survivor, a pioneer, a man forged in the crucible of the new world. Your story, John, is the story of countless others who ventured into the unknown, driven by hope, desperation, or sheer stubborn will. It's a story of suffering and sacrifice, of courage and resilience in the face of unimaginable odds, and it's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, in the most God-forsaken corners of the earth, the human spirit endures. As you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander to those distant shores, to the lonely outposts and struggling settlements that dotted the fringes of the known world. Imagine the faces of the men and women who lived and died there, their dreams and fears, their moments of triumph and despair. In their stories, we find echoes of our own struggles and aspirations, serving as reminders of the indomitable will that has carried our species through the ages. As the night falls and the world grows silent, take solace in the knowledge that you are the beneficiary of their sacrifices, the inheritor of their resilient spirit. Their legacy lives on in the warmth and safety of your bed, in the soft glow of the modern world. It is a testament to the enduring power of the human heart to hope, dream, and persevere against all odds. Rest easy now, and let their stories be the stuff of your dreams. Tales of a time long past, yet forever woven into the fabric of who we are. However, the hardships of the medieval world were not confined to distant outposts and frontier settlements. Even within the heart of civilization, in the grand castles and fortified manor houses that dotted the landscape, life could be harsh, unforgiving, and fraught with danger. Consider the tale of young Elelinena, a scullery maid in the service of a powerful feudal lord. Her life was a constant struggle, filled with endless toil and drudgery. She spent her days scrubbing pots, hauling water, and stoking the great fires of the castle kitchen, working from before dawn until long into the night under the watchful eye of the head cook, a tyrannical woman known for her quick temper and heavy hand. For Elelinena, the castle was a world unto itself, a labyrinthine stone edifice filled with dark corridors, draughty halls, and cramped windowless servants' quarters. She navigated this gloomy realm with a sure-footedness of one born to servitude, her bare feet calloused from the cold flagstones, and her hands chapped and raw from endless immersion in hot water and harsh lye soap. Life in the scullery was a far cry from the glittering world of the nobles who inhabited the castle's upper reaches. While the noble feasted on sumptuous meats, exquisite wines, and delicate pastries, Elelinena and her fellow servants endured a meager existence. Their diet consisted of stale bread, thin gruel, and whatever scraps could be scavenged from the nobles' plates. They slept on soft feather beds, wrapped in furs and fine linens, while the servants huddled together on pallets of straw, shivering beneath thin, patched blankets. Despite these hardships, a certain camaraderie blossomed among the castle's serving class. In the rare moments of respite between their duties, they gathered in the kitchen or courtyards to share stories, gossip, and dreams of a better life. Elelinena found solace in these moments, in the laughter and tears of her fellow servants, and in the knowledge that she was not alone in her struggles. However, even these fleeting rest periods were tainted by the ever-present spectre of danger. Life in a medieval castle was fraught with perils, both visible and hidden. There were the constant threats of fire, disease, and siege, the looming possibility of invasion or upheaval. And there were the more intimate dangers, the whims and cruelties of the nobles, the risk of abuse or exploitation at the hands of those with power over them. Elelinena had witnessed the devastating consequences that could befall a serving girl who caught the eye of a lustful lord or a jealous lady. She had heard the whispered tales of those who vanished in the night, never to be seen again. She lived with the constant fear that one day her own fate might hang in the balance of a noble's passing fancy or a moment's careless transgression. In this world, a servant's life was cheap, their well-being dependent on the whims of their betters. Elelinena understood the importance of caution, keeping her head down and guarding her thoughts. She had learned to read the subtle currents of power and influence that flowed through the castle, to navigate the treacherous waters of feudal politics with a deft and cautious hand. Yet, even amidst the darkness and danger, Elelinena held on to a dream of a different life. In the quiet moments before sleep claims her, she envisions a world beyond the castle walls, a realm of freedom and possibility where she could forge her own path and shape her destiny. Clinging to these dreams like a talisman, a secret fire burns within her heart, fueling her through the long, cold nights and the endless days of toil. For Elelinena, as for countless forgotten souls who labored in the grand houses of the medieval world, life was a constant struggle, a battle against the elements, the cruelties of fate, and the whims of those in power. Yet in their resilience, endurance, and stubborn refusal to succumb to despair, they embodied the very essence of the human spirit, an indomitable will to survive, to hope, and to dream of a better tomorrow. As you drift off to sleep, let your thoughts linger on the life of young Elelinena, on the courage and quiet dignity with which she faced the trials of her existence. In her story, and the stories of countless others like her, we discover a reminder of the strength that resides within us all, the capacity to endure, persevere, and find light even in the darkest of places. So rest now, and let the tales of the past weave themselves into the fabric of your dreams. In the struggles and triumphs of those who came before, we find the seeds of our own resilience, the echoes of our indomitable spirit. And in the quiet of the night, As the world slips away and the realm of dreams takes hold, we honor their memory and draw strength from their enduring legacy. However, the hardships of medieval life were not confined to the realm of the living. For those unfortunate souls who strayed from the law or the whims of the powerful, an even darker fate awaited them in the dank, dismal world of the dungeon. Imagine, if you will, the plight of a man named Thomas, a simple peasant farmer wrongly accused of a crime he did not commit. Dragged from his fields and his family, Thomas finds himself thrown into a cramped, fettered cell. Deep within the bowels of his lord's castle, Thomas found himself at the mercy of his cruel and corrupt jailers. These men reveled in the suffering of their charges, and the conditions in the dungeon were nothing short of horrific. The air was thick with the stench of human misery, a sickly sweet smell of infection and disease. The walls were slick with moisture, and the floors were covered in a layer of filth and grime. Vermin scurried in the shadows, feasting on the meager scraps left by the prisoners. They skittered and squeaked, a constant reminder of the degradation of this place. Each day for Thomas was a waking nightmare. When the guards remembered to feed him, they tossed him mouldy bread and fetid water, barely enough to sustain life. They took perverse pleasure in tormenting him, finding new ways to break his spirit and will. They beat him, starved him, subjected him to unspeakable humiliations, all in the name of extracting a confession for a crime he did not commit. Despite his despair, Thomas clung to his innocence, believing that justice would prevail somehow. He prayed fervently in the darkness, his whispered pleas carried off by the dank stone walls. He dreamed of his wife, Anne. As we delve deeper into the dark annals of medieval history, we come to perhaps the most feared and dreaded of all places, the dungeons. These were not mere prisons for holding criminals awaiting trial or sentencing. No, the dungeons of the Middle Ages were horrific places of suffering, despair, and often cruel, arbitrary punishment at the whims of the powerful. Imagine descending a narrow, slippery stone staircase deep beneath a towering castle. The air grew colder and danker with each step, the only light flickering from torches casting eerie dancing shadows on the rough, hunched walls. The stench of mold, decay, and human misery thickened, making it hard to breathe. At the bottom, a heavy iron-bound door creaks open, revealing a claustrophobic, dimly lit chamber. The floor is covered in cold, damp dirt, scattered with mouldering straw. Filthy, haggard prisoners are shackled to the walls, huddled in small groups or curled up alone in fetal positions. Some moan pitifully or mutter incoherently, while others stare blankly, seemingly devoid of hope. This is the daily existence of the wretched souls condemned to the dungeons. Some are imprisoned for crimes like theft, assault, or rape, but many others are victims of political rivalries, religious persecution, or simply being on the wrong side of someone in power. Innocence means little here. Justice is an illusion. One man slumped against the far wall is Edric, a simple farmer who had a land dispute with the local lord. Edric had the audacity to protest when the nobleman's hunting party trampled his crops and slaughtered his livestock. For his insolence, the hapless farmer was dragged from his family and thrown into the dungeons to rot. That was 3 long years ago. Now Edric is a shell of a man, his skin sallow and hanging loosely on his bones, his once bright eyes dulled by hopelessness. The jailers, when they bother to visit, bring only a few mouldy scraps of bread and a filthy jug of water each day. Many prisoners simply stop eating, preferring the release of death. But physical privation is not the only torment inflicted on the dungeon's residents. The notorious jailer Oswald is a hulking brute known for his cruel streak and twisted creativity in extracting confessions or indulging his own sadistic impulses. His toolbox is a stuff of nightmares. Oswald takes special pleasure in working over new prisoners, relishing their terrified shrieks as he introduces them to his grim array of devices, the thumbscrews, the Iron Maiden, and the rack. Even the threat of these implements is often enough to shatter the spirit and induce babbling compliance to any accusation. Few prisoners in Oswald's domain dare to dream of freedom or deliverance. Most succumb to a grim resignation, hoping for a swift death. When the cell door slams shut behind you, it feels as if the world above ceases to exist, leaving only the unending nightmare of the dungeon. Yet even in the depths of despair, the resilience of the human spirit sometimes endures. Prisoners share stories to cling to fading memories of the outside world, exchanging precious crumbs of food and sips of water. They whisper prayers and words of encouragement. Edric found solace in an unexpected way. In a corner of his cell, behind a loose stone, he discovered a scrap of charcoal. With the fleeting light of the guttering torches, he began sketching on the walls. Initially, his drawings were crude stick-like figures, but with practice, they grew increasingly detailed and evocative. He captured scenes from his past life, his modest cottage, his wife's smiling face, his children playing in the fields. He sketched his fellow prisoners, their haunted visages, and even depicted Oswald as a snarling, demon-like figure. It was as if by putting their reality to paper, he could somehow master it. His artwork didn't go unnoticed. Other prisoners begged Edric to sketch their loved ones from their descriptions, clinging to these fragile images as talismans against the darkness. Even some of the guards were moved by his work and repaid him by smuggling in extra candles, charcoal, and occasionally scraps of meat. For Edric, his art became a lifeline, a way to preserve his sanity and humanity in the face of overwhelming degradation. He may die here in this hellish pit, but a part of him, the part that creates, that imagines, that sees beauty even in the darkest places, will live on, undefeated. The dungeons of the Middle Ages broke the bodies and crushed the souls of countless unfortunates. They were, in many ways, a microcosm of the cruelty, injustice, and oppression that plagued much of medieval life for the powerless. However, as Edric's story reminds us, there were also glimmers of light amidst the darkness. The enduring hope, the solidarity born from shared suffering, and the determination to preserve one's dignity and spirit against all odds were all part of the human experience, even in the most dire circumstances. As we emerge from the depths of the dungeons into the light of day, it is worth reflecting on the incredible resilience and unquenchable spirit of our ancestors who endured such harrowing conditions. Their struggles and triumphs, no matter how small or forgotten by history, serve as a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit. So, as you drift off to sleep in the comfort of your modern bed, spare a thought for those who came before, who survived the worst that medieval life could throw at them. Perhaps in your dreams, you'll envision a brighter future for them, where hope and humanity finally triumph over the darkness. As we delve deeper into the grim realities of medieval life, it is important to remember that even those who held positions of power and privilege were not immune to the dangers and hardships of the time. In fact, some of the most miserable existences could be found within the cold stone walls of Europe's castles and fortresses. Take, for example, the story of young William, a lowly servant toiling away in the scullery of a dank, draughty castle in 13th century England. William's days were an endless cycle of back-breaking labor, scrubbing grimy pots, hauling heavy buckets of water, and stoking the fires of the massive kitchen hearths. From before sunrise until well past sunset, he was at the beck and call of the tyrannical head cook, a short-tempered man who doled out swift and painful punishments for even the slightest of mistakes. Life in the castle was a stark contrast to the romanticized tales of chivalry and courtly love that William had heard as a child. The living quarters were cramped, cold, and perpetually damp, with narrow windows that let in little light and even less fresh air. Privacy was a luxury few could afford, and the constant noise and bustle of the castle made it nearly impossible to find peace. Perhaps even more oppressive than the physical discomforts was the rigidly hierarchical society that governed every aspect of castle life. As a lowly servant, William was at the very bottom of the pecking order. Subject to the whims and abuses of not only the head cook, but also the kitchen maids, the sculls, and even the castle dogs, he quickly learned to keep his head down, his mouth shut, and never question the orders of his superiors. Despite the hardships, William found small moments of solace in the camaraderie of his fellow servants. In the precious few hours between their duties, they would gather in the warmth of the kitchen, sharing meager meals and swapping stories of their lives before coming to the castle. For many, it was the only family they had ever known. But even these small comforts could not ease the gnawing hunger in William's belly or the ache in his bones from long hours of toil. He dreamed of a better life, of a world beyond the castle walls where he could be his own master and live by his own rules. But deep down, he knew that such dreams were foolish. For a lowly servant in a medieval castle, there was no escape from the grim realities of daily life. As the years passed, William watched as the world outside the castle walls seemed to grow even more dangerous and unpredictable. Tales of war, plague, and famine filtered in from the countryside, and the castle became increasingly fortified against the threat of attack. The once bustling courtyard was now a grim and forbidding place, patrolled by heavily armed guards and filled with the clatter of weapons and armor. Even the lords and ladies of the castle were not immune to the pervasive sense of fear and unease that gripped the land. They retreated into their private chambers, surrounded by loyal retainers and heavily armed guards. The once vibrant great hall, filled with feasting and merriment, now stood empty and echoing, a stark reminder of the dark times that had befallen the kingdom. Life in the castle had become a waking nightmare for William. He was trapped in a never-ending cycle of toil and hardship, with no hope of escape. But even in his darkest moments, he clung to the small sparks of humanity that still flickered in the hearts of those around him. The kindness of a fellow servant, the fleeting smile of a kitchen maid, the gentle nuzzle of a castle dog, these were the things that kept him going, the tiny glimmers of light in an otherwise bleak and unforgiving world. As the castle walls seemed to close in around him, William couldn't help but wonder what lay beyond the horizon. Were there lands untouched by the ravages of war and disease, places where a man could live free and unencumbered by the chains of servitude? He knew that he would likely never find out, but still, the dream persisted, a tiny flame of hope in a world gone mad. Years turned into decades, and William grew old and grey within the castle walls. His once strong back now stooped from years of labor, his hands gnarled and scarred from countless burns and cuts. But even as his body failed him, his mind remained sharp and clear, a testament to the indomitable human spirit that had sustained him through so many trials and tribulations. Looking back on his life, William couldn't help but feel a profound sense of sadness and regret. He had been born into a world that was not of his making, a world that had used him up and cast him aside like so much refuse. But even in his darkest moments, he had never lost sight of the one thing that truly mattered, his own humanity. In the end, it wasn't the grand tales of kings and queens that would endure, but the small, everyday acts of kindness and compassion that made life truly worth living. The smile of a child, the touch of a loved one's hand, the warmth of a fire on a cold winter's night. These were the things that truly mattered, enduring long after the castle walls crumbled to dust. As William lay on his deathbed, surrounded by the faces of those he had come to know and love over the years, a sense of peace washed over him. He had lived a hard life, one of unimaginable hardship and suffering, but he had also known moments of joy and laughter, of love and companionship. And in the end, that was enough. With a final rattling breath, he closed his eyes and let the darkness take him, secure in the knowledge that he had lived a life worth living, even in the worst of times and places. As his spirit drifted off into the great unknown, he couldn't help but smile at the thought of all the adventures that lay ahead in this life and the next. For you see, dear listener, even in the darkest of times, there is always hope to be found, always a glimmer of light to guide us through the shadows. And it is in these moments of despair and hardship that we discover the true strength and resilience of the human spirit. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, take a moment to reflect on the incredible journey that has brought you to this moment. The trials and tribulations you have faced, the moments of joy and sorrow that have shaped you into the person you are today. Know that no matter what challenges may lie ahead, you have the strength and the courage to face them head-on, just as William did so many centuries ago. Rest now, dear listener, and let the gentle embrace of sleep carry you off to a world of dreams and possibilities. For tomorrow is a new day, full of new adventures and new opportunities to make your mark upon the world. With a heart brimming with hope and a spirit brimming with courage, there's nothing you can't achieve. Good night and sweet dreams. The next unfortunate soul we'll encounter is a battle-hardened mercenary named Aldrich. Aldrich has witnessed more than his fair share of bloodshed and misery along the desolate borderlands between two warring kingdoms. For decades, this disputed frontier has been plagued by incessant raids, skirmishes, and power struggles between rival lords vying for control. The once fertile fields now lie scorched and barren, dotted with abandoned villages and the ruins of keeps destroyed in the fighting. Aldrich was born into this harsh existence, the son of a poor farmer who turned soldier. From a young age, he learned to wield a sword and sleep with one eye open, always alert for the sounds of approaching hoofbeats in the night. When their small village was set ablaze by a marauding army, Aldrich barely escaped with his life. His parents and sister weren't so fortunate. On that dreadful night, choking on smoke and cradling his dying father, the young man vowed to seek revenge against those responsible. In the years that followed, Aldrich grew into a formidable warrior, offering his skills to whoever lord or warlord was willing to pay the most. He gained renown for his bravery on the battlefield and ruthlessness in hunting down the enemies of his patrons. However, each gory victory and pile of silver only seemed to harden his heart further. The innocent, idealistic boy was long gone, replaced by a jaded, cynical man who trusted no one. Despite his grizzled exterior, even a seasoned fighter like Aldrich wasn't immune to the perils and hardships of life on the blood-soaked borderlands. He had lost count of the many friends and comrades in arms he had seen fall over the years, their bodies left to rot in the sun or be scavenged by birds. He himself bore the scars of 100 desperate melees and ambushes, including a wicked gash down his sword arm that ended his days of wielding a blade. With his fighting career behind him, Aldrich, a former fighter, retired to a crumbling stone tower overlooking a desolate valley. Among the border wasteland's few recognizable landmarks, he awaited the end of his days alone, his fading memories and old battle wounds aching when it rained. Gazing out over the war-torn landscape, he often wondered about the purpose of all the bloodshed, ruined lives, and destroyed homes. For what had it all been? A few miles of burnt, useless borderland, constantly shifting hands between petty rulers. As he sat wrapped in a moth-eating cloak, sipping sour wine from a dented tin cup, he realized there was no real victor here, only victims. The true rulers were misery, brutality, and the never-ending conflict itself. He had escaped the borderlands, but its dark legacy would forever haunt him. Somewhere out there, new orphans were being forged in the fires of destruction, ready to pick up the sword and continue the cycles of violence as they always had. Such was the way of things in the lawless marches, where only crows and worms profited from men's follies. From one harrowing hinterland, they now set sail across the heaving seas to an equally inhospitable environment. The early colonial outposts clung precariously to the edges of the known medieval world. Imagine a creaking, leaky wooden ship packed with desperate souls who had left their familiar lives behind, risking everything to seek their fortunes in a new world. After enduring months of storms, sickness, and dwindling supplies, they stagger ashore in a hostile wilderness, confronted by indigenous peoples understandably wary of the pale strangers invading their ancestral lands. Among these unlucky adventurers was a young man named John. John, the third son of a poor baker in London, had grown up hearing tales of exotic new continents waiting to be claimed. These continents were said to be teeming with gold and brimming with endless possibilities for any man brave enough to seize the chance. Anything sounded better than a lifetime of struggling to make ends meet and fighting his brothers for meager morsels. So, John seized the opportunity to join a colonial expedition as an indentured servant, willing to endure 7 years of labor in exchange for his passage and a small parcel of virgin land. However, as often happens, the reality awaiting the naive settlers stood in stark contrast to the grand promises that had lured them across the Atlantic. Instead of a new Eden overflowing with riches and resources, they found a harsh, unforgiving land. Scorching summers, bone-chilling winters, and thick, disorienting forests stretched endlessly before them. The established colony they had been expecting was little more than a muddy square of ramshackle huts behind a flimsy wooden palisade. From the moment John staggered ashore, weak and blinking from the long confinement in the bowels of the ship, he was thrust into back-breaking labor. He toiled from dawn to dusk, hacking farmland from the dense woods. Each swing of the axe was met with clouds of biting insects, and the constant fear of an ambush by the shadowy natives lurking between the trees kept him on edge. It was a brutal initiation for a soft city dweller who was utterly unprepared for such ceaseless grinding toil. As the weeks turned into months, life in the colony descended into dire straits. Precious seed stocks rotted in the humid weather, leaving the settlers with meager crops insufficient to feed the swelling ranks of new arrivals. Dissent, fever, and starvation began to take their toll, filling a growing cemetery on a lonely hill. Leaders who had proclaimed themselves governors and proprietors soon revealed themselves as petty tyrants, hoarding dwindling supplies and ruthlessly suppressing any hint of dissent among the increasingly desperate colonists. For John, the final straw came when he witnessed the colony's self-proclaimed marshal coldly executing a terrified native woman accused of stealing from the company stores. He shot her in the back as she attempted to flee with a sack of moldy grain. The casual cruelty and complete disregard for a human life made John violently ill. In that moment, he realized this was not a society he wanted any part of. That night, he made a risky decision and fled into the dense forest. Initially, every snapping twig and flitting shadow sent his heart racing with visions of Indian war bands or pursuing soldiers. However, as John ventured deeper into the sea of trees, a strange sense of peace and purpose began to settle over him. He may be alone in this alien world, but at least he was free, beholden to no one, able to meet whatever fate had in store for him on his own terms. Armed with a few rusted tools and a small stash of seeds, John embarked on the arduous and solitary task of forging a new life in the depths of the primeval forest. From one brutal outpost of colonial exploitation, we journey to an institution synonymous with the darkest excesses of medieval times, the castle dungeon. These dank, claustrophobic warrens were used to imprison a diverse group of individuals, including hardened criminals, enemy soldiers, political dissidents, and the mere unlucky. Many of these souls never saw the light of day again, condemned to suffer and die in the dark, damp bowels of an uncaring fortress. Our next tale centers on one such unfortunate individual, a young woman named Elaine. Elaine was a simple peasant from a village near a powerful lord's castle. Her life was a constant struggle, filled with ceaseless drudgery. She toiled from the first light in the smoky confines of her peasant hovel, struggling to grow enough food on her family's meager plot to pay the ever-increasing tithes and taxes demanded by the aristocracy. Like most, Elaine bore the injustice with weary resignation until the fateful day when the Lord's men arrived to drag away her sickly younger sister. They accused her of stealing a loaf of bread from the castle kitchens. When Elaine confronted the cruel steward, pleading for mercy on behalf of her sibling, he made her a horrifying offer. He would release the girl if Elaine took her place, offering her virtue to satisfy his twisted lusts. Elaine refused, unwilling to debase herself before such a monster. Enraged, the steward had her dragged down to the deepest, darkest dungeon and shackled to the filth-encrusted wall, vowing she would never again see her son until she submitted to his desires. But Elaine's will was stronger than the steward anticipated. For weeks after weeks, she endured the gnawing hunger, the bone-numbing cold, the incessant drip of water, and the scurrying of flea-bitten rats. Her world shrank to the few feet of fetid straw she huddled upon, and the meager ration of maggoty bread and brackish water shoved through a slot in the solid oak door. In the suffocating darkness, time lost all meaning. She took to talking to the tiny baby rats, coaxing them to her with crumbs and giving them names like the children she now realized she would likely never have. The one thing that sustained Elaine through the endless monotony of misery was her anger, a hard, flinty core of defiance that the sadistic steward's frequent visits could not extinguish. No matter how he taunted and threatened her, she came to almost relish his rages, knowing that her refusal to break was the one weapon she had against her captors. Elaine took dark satisfaction, imagining the indignities and punishments she would inflict on the self-important lord and his toadies if she ever got the chance. A litany of pain that she turned over in her mind during the long hours alone in the dark. But as the weeks turned into months, her cramped muscles wasted, and her skin turned ghostly pale. Part of Elaine began to despair that chance would never come, that she would end her days a tattered bag of bones in this lightless hole, defiant to the last, but ultimately forgotten. Then came the night, when distant shouts and clashing metal echoed dimly through the thick dungeon walls. The fortress was under attack. Whether they were brave rebels or simply a rival lord's army, Elaine neither knew nor cared. This was the opportunity she had dreamed of. When the battle sounds finally faded and a new, deeper silence fell over the castle, Elaine began to shout and bang her rusted chains against the door with all her fading strength. Most of the guards had likely been called away to defend the walls. Perhaps, just perhaps, there would be no one to hear her. She kept up the cacophony for what felt like hours until her voice gave out and her wrists were slick with blood. And then, just as despair began to close in again, Elaine heard the scraping sound of a heavy iron key turning in the lock. From one dungeon's desolate depths, we emerge blinking into the thin light of an equally dismal environment. The sprawling, filthy encampment of an army lay siege to an enemy stronghold. The medieval era was one of near-constant warfare, as rival kings, lords, and religious factions vied for power and territory. When an attacking force met a castle or fortified city that refused to surrender, they would encamp around it, choking off all supply lines and escape routes, and settling in for the long, grim business of starving out the defenders. These sieges could last anywhere from a few weeks to many months, sometimes even years in the case of great cities like Constantinople or Jerusalem. For the soldiers squatting in the muddy fields and shivering forests surrounding the battlements, siege warfare was an excruciating test of endurance and will. With little shelter from the elements beyond what crude leantos and trenches they could dig, besieging troops suffered terribly from exposure, disease, and sheer crushing boredom. One man all too familiar with such trials was a grizzled old sergeant named Ivo. A peasant conscript from Lombardy, Ivo had spent over 2 decades serving in a condottiere company, private mercenary armies hired by Italian city-states for combat. During this time, he witnessed numerous sieges, enduring miserable conditions in various weathers while waiting for the lords to conclude their negotiations and threats, so he could resume the brutal yet swiftly executed combat. This particular siege seemed particularly cursed. The army had arrived in the height of summer, anticipating a swift surrender from the small castle. However, behind its formidable stone walls, the defenders proved resilient, compelling the besiegers to endure a prolonged siege. As the weeks dragged on, the camp descended into a muck-filled quagmire, churned up by the relentless march of thousands of soldiers and the hooves of destriers. With latrine trenches overflowing and an influx of new recruits arriving daily, the cramped, ramshackle shelters quickly became a breeding ground for disease. Camp fever and flux soon spread, leaving men waking in the morning with sniffling and cold bed rolls by nightfall, their faces swollen and yellowed with pustules. After the first month, Ivo ceased learning the names of the fresh-faced recruits, knowing most would soon meet their end in the burial pit. Despite his extensive experience, the stench of the contagion tents, the moans and wails, and the buzzing of corpse flies still unsettled the seasoned soldiers. However, illness was not the sole peril in the siege trenches. The defenders soon resorted to harassing the encampment with midnight raids and showers of arrows and fiery debris launched from their lofty battlements. Ivo lost count of the number of sleeping men he had witnessed, dragged screaming into the darkness after creeping sappers emerged from hidden tunnels or were incinerated by flaming naphtha raining from the sky. He himself bore a thick knot of scar tissue on his thigh, a testament to the impact of a crossbow bolt that had torn through muscle and sinew to the bone. Through the relentless siege, the soldiers endured unimaginable suffering, resorting to dark mutterings against their commander, a pompous young noble who directed the sorry affair from a lavish tent far behind the lines. Desertion and open mutiny were whispered among the ranks, but harsh punishment and meager rations held back open rebellion for now. As another dreary autumn loomed, Ivo kept his head down and his cracked lips sealed, having long since lost any illusions of glory or honor. His sole concern was survival and drawing his next pitiful payment. At least the siege offered one cold comfort, Ivo mused darkly as he drew his ragged blanket closer in the driving rain, contemplating the grim satisfaction of knowing his noble masters and their pretty castle-dwelling foes were suffering the same. Hunger, disease, and exposure were the great equalizers, relentless foes that ground both gilded knights and lowly pikemen alike into the same muck and misery. In the end, sieges revealed the ultimate truth of war. Pain was the only victor, and death the only lasting peace. As our dreary tour through the darkest corners of the medieval world draws to a close, it's worth reflecting on what we've witnessed. From the bustling alleys of teeming cities to the bloody borderlands, dank dungeons to pestilential siege camps, each environment we explored was defined by profound hardship, cruelty, and suffering. These experiences remind us that for the vast majority of people, life in the Middle Ages was often nasty, brutish, and short. Yet even in these grim places, humanity endured, finding moments of grace, courage, or grim resolve. The people we met along the way, John seeking a new life in the new world, Elaine defiant in the depths of the dungeons, speak to a resilience of spirit that can never be fully extinguished, even in the grimmest of circumstances. As we bid farewell to Ivo, Uldric, and the other soldiers and mercenaries from our past, we should count ourselves fortunate to enjoy the comforts they could never imagine. Not only do we have the physical trappings of modern life, but we also possess the hard-won ideas of justice, dignity, and basic human rights that were denied to most medieval folk. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight in your warm bed under your sturdy roof, take a moment to appreciate your blessings. The world, despite its modern troubles, is in many ways a kinder and more humane place today than the medieval souls we met tonight could have ever dreamed. If your slumber is disturbed by dark dreams of plague pits or dungeon chains, or if you find yourself contemplating the fragility of civilized life and all we take for granted, spare a thought for those who came before us and the hard-scrabble lives they endured. By remembering and reckoning with the darkness of the past, we can truly appreciate the light and possibilities of our present. The medieval world laid the foundations of our own, for better or worse. By confronting the worst of what was, we are better equipped to imagine and work towards the best of what might be. But for now, on behalf of John, Elaine, Ivo, myself, and all the other shades of history you've encountered in this humble series, we bid you good night and pleasant dreams in your corner of a world those who came before could scarcely envision. The medieval era may have been a time of great suffering and strife, but it was also an age of endurance, ingenuity, and so we turn our gaze now to the remote and often neglected corners of the medieval world, the distant frontier outposts and colonies on the fringes of civilization. Life in these remote settlements could be just as challenging and unforgiving as in the overcrowded cities and disease-ravaged towns we've explored so far. Imagine for a moment that you're a settler brimming with dreams of opportunity and adventure, boarding a ship bound for a newly established colony on a distant shore. The journey is long and perilous, fraught with threats of storms, pirates, and deadly illnesses lurking at every turn. Many perish before ever reaching their destination, but let's say you're one of the fortunate ones who survives the harrowing voyage. As you step onto the sandy beach of this brave new world, what awaits you? At first glance, the untamed wilderness and shimmering blue waters may appear like a tropical paradise compared to the filthy cities you left behind. Swaying palm trees, rock-crawling birds, and intriguing new foods hint at the promise of a fresh start in a land of abundance. However, you soon discover that life in the colonies is far from idyllic. The oppressive heat drains your energy, vicious insects leave you covered in painful welts, and strange new diseases stalk the makeshift settlement. The colonial authorities, desperate to impose order and extract maximum productivity from this new territory, rule with an iron fist. Fail to meet your work quotas, and you risk being whipped or locked in a sweltering wooden cage under the blistering sun. Step out of line or anger the wrong official, and you could be cast out of the colony entirely, left to fend for yourself in the untamed jungle. For the indigenous peoples whose ancestral lands you now occupy, your arrival heralds an even more dire fate. Lacking immunity to diseases like smallpox and measles, native populations are decimated by epidemics spread from the unsanitary ships and filthy sailors. Enslavement, forced relocation, and genocide become grim realities of colonial life. As greed and bigotry fuel increasingly harsh policies, the societal bonds and ancient traditions that nurtured these unique cultures for generations crumble under this relentless onslaught. Amidst this turmoil, the naive dreams that propelled so many across the ocean to this harsh new reality swiftly dissipate. Let us delve into the story of Miguel, a young man from an impoverished Iberian village who eagerly joined a colonial expedition. Enticed by the allure of land and riches, recruiters painted vivid pictures of gem-encrusted streams, trees laden with exotic delicacies, and docile natives eager to share their bounty with industrious settlers. It all sounded too good to be true, and indeed it was. From the moment his parched and cracked feet touched the beach, Miguel was subjected to grueling labor. He rose before dawn, hacking through dense foliage and constructing rudimentary shelters under the scorching sun. Mosquitoes feasted on his blood, leaving him shivering with fever, while his stomach revolted against the unfamiliar foreign foods. There were no streets of gold to be found, no spices growing from the ground to make him wealthy overnight. His overlords were solely concerned with the number of trees he could fell in a day and the amount of gold he could extract from the streams to enrich their coffers back home. Any resistance was met with brutal and public punishment to serve as a warning to others. Miguel witnessed in horror as a defiant young man from his ship was flogged until his skin peeled off his back and left to die in the stocks as a chilling reminder to others. As the scorching days dragged into months, Miguel's youthful optimism withered alongside his physical condition. When an insect bite inflamed and then necrotized a tender in his leg, the colony's harsh leaders compelled him to continue working, fearing that he would forfeit his already meager share of imagined future riches. By the time the leg turned black and the fever gripped his mind, it was too late. Like many others, Miguel perished far from his family, who had hoped his colonial venture would provide them with a way out of poverty. His story was all too common in lawless colonies like this one, a mere broken body crushed beneath the wheels of empire and greed. Life in these tenuous outposts was precarious, with settlers like Miguel caught between the ruthless whims of the authorities and the perils of an unforgiving new land. Behind the triumphant tales of conquest and untold riches lay a darker reality of abuse, disease, and shattered dreams. So, as you curl up in your soft, warm bed tonight, perhaps spare a thought for people like Miguel and the native islanders, whose lives were brutally upended by colonial expansion. As your head sinks into your plush pillow, remember that you are among the fortunate who have never endured such trials. Let that gratitude lull you into a restful slumber. As we leave the dismal colonies behind and continue our journey through the worst places to live in medieval times, our next destination will be an altogether different sort of isolated, regimented settlement. However, the scourges of disease and oppression will still be keenly felt. We're going to venture now inside the remote stone walls of a secluded monastery perched high on a rugged, wind-whipped cliff. Life in these spiritual outposts could be every bit as demanding and Spartan as what we've witnessed in the colonies, albeit with a very different set of guiding principles. Monasteries occupied a unique and often contradictory place in medieval society. On one hand, they served as sanctuaries for spiritual contemplation, where men and women could dedicate their lives to prayer, scholarship, and service to their faith. The most renowned orders took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, renouncing worldly possessions and pleasures in pursuit of divine grace. At their peak, these monasteries offered a chance to transcend the harsh realities of medieval life and connect with a higher purpose. However, the reality within these secluded stone compounds often fell short of the romanticized ideal. Monks and nuns endured grueling labor, strict discipline, and constant hardship. They rose before dawn for the first of many daily prayer services, huddled in unheated stone chapels to chant for hours on end. Between prayers, they worked tirelessly to maintain their isolated communities, toiling in the fields, copying manuscripts, tending to the sick, all to ensure their survival in a harsh and unforgiving world. The rules governing monastic life were unwavering and strict. Vows of silence forbade frivolous speech for days or even years on end. Any transgression, such as tardiness, inattentiveness, or disrespect, could result in severe punishments, including isolation and flaying with a whip. In a society that valued self-denial, there was little room for levity or leisure. Existence revolved around prayer, labor, and quiet suffering, all for the promise of eternal reward in the afterlife. Consider the case of Brother Ulrich, a studious young man who entered the monastery with dreams of dedicating his life to scholarly pursuits. He had always felt like an outsider in his rough, rural community, more at home among the dusty tomes and scrolls of the church library than behind a plough in the fields. He believed that the cloistered life would provide an oasis of intellectual stimulation and spiritual growth, free from the distractions and vices of the outside world. Initially, Ulrich embraced his new environment. The hushed murmur of voices echoing in the vaulted chapel soothed his soul, while the meticulously maintained gardens and grounds exuded a sense of higher order and purpose. He took to his duties in the scriptorium with enthusiasm, marveling at the opportunity to read precious texts and engage in philosophical discussions with his fellow initiates. However, as the years passed, Ulrich grew increasingly restless and dissatisfied with the rigid and austere nature of monastic life. While his mind yearned for freedom, his aging body bore the physical toll of endless labor and deprivation. The monotonous daily routine of prayer and toil blurred the lines between seasons, making time seem like an indistinct haze of grey stone and suffering. Witnessing his youthful comrades slowly succumb to the burdens of life, Ulrich's once unwavering faith began to waver. Doubts crept into his prayers, and nagging questions that couldn't find answers within the order's ironclad orthodoxy plagued him. With each passing year, the warm light that once illuminated his vision of God dimmed and receded, replaced by an unsettling emptiness that even fervent devotion couldn't alleviate. By the time he reached a senior position within the order, Ulrich had become a hollowed-out husk of the bright-eyed youth who had eagerly joined the monastic life decades earlier. His skin had become as translucent and brittle as the faded parchment he spent his days hunched over, while his eyes were milky with cataracts from straining to read by flickering candlelight. The higher purpose that had once seemed tantalizingly close now felt like a mocking mirage, receding further with each painstaking step. Ulrich's story serves as a poignant reminder of the harsh realities that could lurk beneath the serene facade of monastic life. While some monks found spiritual fulfillment in this austere and regimented world, others were crushed by its relentless demands and privations. The very qualities that made the monastery a haven from the chaos and brutality of medieval society could also transform it into a kind of prison, a life sentence in the service of an increasingly elusive ideal. As you reflect on Ulrich's quiet despair, the dreams and doubts slowly suffocated within those thick stone walls, remember once again how fortunate you are to rest your weary head in a place of warmth and comfort this night. Your soft mattress and gently billowing curtains are a world away from the hard pallets and bare cells that counted as luxury to the medieval monastic. The freedom to let your mind wander as you drift off to sleep was a gift utterly denied to those beautiful souls locked in an endless cycle of prayer and service until their very last breath. So, as you feel yourself sliding gently into the welcoming embrace of slumber, whisper a word of thanks into the still night air for the small mercies of your present life. Mercies that would seem like unimaginable riches to so many who came before, whether toiling in a distant colony, chanting in a draughty chapel, or facing any of the myriad other hardships that were part and parcel of the medieval experience. The final leg of our journey through this distant and often dismal era shall lead us to one of the grimmest destinations of all, a place where the stony austerity of the monastery meets the casual brutality of the lawless outpost. Prepare yourself now to descend into the dank and dismal depths of the medieval dungeon, where cruelty and despair fester in the shadows of indifferent power. In the centuries before the rise of formal prison systems, dungeons served as catch-all solutions for a society with little concept of humane confinement. Whether you were a captured enemy soldier, an accused heretic awaiting trial, a common thief, or simply a peasant who had offended the wrong noble, you might find yourself thrown into one of these reeking pits to endure all manner of torment and privation. The conditions in a typical dungeon were nothing short of hellish. Prisoners were crammed into filthy, lightless cells, with little more than a pile of fetid straw to sleep on if they were lucky. Food and water were scarce, often used as tools of torture and control by sadistic jailers. Disease ran rampant in the close, damp quarters, with prisoners' wounds and sores left to fester and rot. The stench of bodily waste, sickness, and death hung heavy in the air, a miasma that seeped into everything and everyone. As wretched as the physical conditions were, the psychological torment was often even worse. The screams of the tortured echoed endlessly through the stone corridors, a chilling reminder of the fate that could befall anyone at any moment. Prisoners might languish for years without learning the charges against them, let alone receiving any semblance of due process or trial. Those who displeased their captives could find themselves contorted in diabolical devices like the rack, the Iron Maiden, or the spado, their bodies stretched and broken in service of the jailer's cruel whims. Consider the plight of a young woman named Maud, arrested on suspicion of witchcraft by the soldiers of the local fiefdom. She was a simple healer who tended to the sick with herbs and prayer. Maud made the mistake of spurning the advances of a minor noble who then accused her of bewitching him with her evil magic. She was dragged screaming from her small cottage and flung into the musty darkness of the castle dungeon, her pleas of innocence and mercy falling on deaf ears. In the days and weeks that followed, Maud endured an unrelenting nightmare of abuse and terror. Her jailers taunted her mercilessly, alternating promises of lenience in exchange for sexual favors with vicious beatings that left her body a map of mottled bruises. They let her slowly starve and smolder with thirst, breaking her down inch by ruthless inch until she began to question her own hold on reality. When she still refused to confess to the imaginary crimes they had pinned on her, the torture escalated to new heights of inventive cruelty. She was stretched on the rack until her joints separated with wet pops and her tendons snapped like frayed lute strings. Thumbscrews crushed the delicate bones of her hands to splinters, while crazed laughter and spittle sprayed across her face. Despite the agony, Maud clung to memories of the peaceful life of service she had known, but it felt like mist slipping through her trembling fingers. By the time they finally brought her up for the mockery of a trial, Maud was a broken shell, willing to confess to anything to alleviate the pain for a fleeting moment. The magistrates needed little encouragement to pronounce her guilty and condemn her to the stake. Another soul was sacrificed on the altar of fear and orthodoxy. As the flames licked her ruined body and the jeers of the crowd filled her ears, perhaps Maud's final thoughts were to wonder what she had ever done to deserve such a fate. Mud's story is but one of countless tragedies that unfolded in medieval dungeons, where the cruelty of men was limited only by the boundaries of their dark imaginations. These dank pits bore witness to oceans of innocent blood and mountains of mangled flesh, all to quench the insatiable thirst of unchecked power. They were holes in the world, where the darkest aspects of human nature ran rampant, and even the strongest spirits were eventually broken by the relentless wheel of want and brutality. So, as you feel the last remnants of sleep dragging your eyelids closed, offer a prayer of remembrance for those lost souls like Mordu, who met such grim fates in the stinking dungeons of castles and keeps. These souls, whose only crime was often being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or daring to defy the cruel dictates of petty tyrants, were denied the warm embrace of mercy, as foreign as the plush mattress that now cradles your weary form. As your mind drifts through the mists of history, traversing the treacherous paths we've shared, remember the abundance of gratitude in this moment. You are safe, warm, and free, shielded from the casual barbarism that once lurked around every corner. The horrors conjured this night are mere shadows, vivid yet mere ghosts of a distant past that cannot harm you now. Let them dissolve like wisps of cloud scattered by the rising sun of your consciousness. Feel your mind emptying of blood and fear, replaced by the simple contentment that is your birthright. As the last vestiges of wakefulness dissolve into the cool, dark waters of sleep, know that you will emerge rested, refreshed, and ready to greet the new day as a gift. This gift would be almost unimaginable to the medieval souls you've walked in the minds of tonight. Sleep now and sleep sweetly, secure in the knowledge that the worst is behind you and the best is yet to come. Let the whispering winds of history extinguish the flickering candle of your waking mind and surrender yourself to the warm embrace of night. The monsters are all in the past, and the morning holds nothing but promise. So breathe deeply, settle into your soft nest of blankets, and let yourself gently fall into the welcoming arms of oblivion. The hard roads are at an end, and you have nothing ahead but the sweet silence of untroubled dreams. Here is the continuation of the narration for the worst places to live during medieval times. Disease was an ever-present spectre, stalking the narrow streets and looming over every aspect of life. Without understanding of germs or hygiene, pestilence spread like wildfire through the packed neighborhoods. Outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid fever, and smallpox regularly decimated the population. The worst killer of all was the dreaded Black Death, capable of wiping out half a town in a matter of months. Imagine the scene in a once thriving port, now ravaged by the latest outbreak of plague. The vibrant sounds of trade and bustling activity have been replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the mournful cries of the sick and grieving. A thick haze of smoke hangs over the town, emanating from the constant burning of bodies. The stench of death is inescapable, permeating the air. Carts laden with corpses trundle through the deserted streets, their desperate drivers clad in waxed leather head to toe, reminiscent of something from a nightmare. These are the plague doctors, their beaked masks stuffed with perfumed straw to mask the suffocating smell. Yet their efforts are futile, as they too succumb to the pestilence, just like the very victims they strive to treat. Among these doctors was a man named Giles Diont, a promising surgeon. In 1720, when the plague struck Marseille, he left his home in Paris to help the afflicted. The cause of this gruesome disease, characterized by oozing buboes and black boils, remained a mystery. Giles attempted various treatments, including bleeding the ill and concocting potions of ground snake and mercury. However, none could halt the relentless grip of the Black Death. Day after day, Giles labored tirelessly, his bird-like mask instilling terror as he made his rounds. Initially, he recoiled from the blackened, contorted faces of the deceased, but gradually the corpses blurred into a ceaseless procession of grief. The sounds that filled Giles's mind as he drifted off to sleep each night were the cries of orphaned children, the desperate prayers of the dying, and the shrieks of the mad. These were the haunting melodies that accompanied him in his dockside garret, a place filled with the pungent aroma of vinegar. Despite his prodigious constitution, even Giles's strength waned over time. The telltale lumps appeared on his groin, followed by black vomit and delirium. As he shivered on his cot, watching the rats scurry by, his thoughts wandered to the lush green fields of his youth. So far removed from the horrors that now surrounded him, he had only ever wanted to help and heal. But the plague proved to be an insurmountable force, surpassing the feeble efforts of any man. Giles, like countless others before him, slipped away with a sigh, adding to the grim tally of the plague's victims. The trauma of such orals lingered long after the disease subsided, shattering families, decimating trades, and depopulating entire villages. The Black Death shook society to its core, leaving the medieval world forever changed. Beyond the city walls, even in normal times, perils abounded. The life of a medieval peasant was one of backbreaking labor from dawn to dusk. Up to 90% of people were farmers bound to the land in a feudal system that reaped nearly all they sowed. They endured the whims of the weather and the vagaries of the harvest in a subsistence existence that was always one failed crop away from starvation. On the frontiers and borderlands, the little security people had was stripped away. Marauding bandits, invading armies, and desperate outlaws preyed on those trying to make a living in the lawless reaches beyond the protection of kings. The disputed borderlands between England and Scotland were one such place of strife. In the early 1300s, this lush but blood-soaked landscape was the scene of constant raids and skirmishes. As the two kingdoms vied for supremacy, the common folk were caught in the middle, their fields burned, livestock stolen, and homes set ablaze by both sides. Imagine the scene in a humble thatch-roofed cottage as a battle raged nearby. As we've seen, life in medieval cities was often a struggle for survival. The cramped quarters, lack of sanitation, and constant threat of disease made urban living a far cry from the romantic notions we might imagine. But for the poorest and most vulnerable members of society, even these squalid conditions could be out of reach. Many towns had a seedy underbelly where the destitute and desperate scraped by in abject poverty. These crime-ridden slums were breeding grounds for theft, violence, and exploitation. The flickering light of a tallow candle illuminates the grimy alleyways. In this world of cutthroats and cut purses, imagine the plight of a young orphan named Alice. At the tender age of 7, her parents succumbed to the devastating pox, leaving her to fend for herself on the unforgiving streets. By day, she begs for scraps and scours the midden heaps for anything of value. By night, she huddles in a dingy nook, shivering against the cold stones, clutching a rusty knife under her threadbare blanket. This rusty knife serves as her only protection against the leering men and vicious street dogs that prowl after dark. Alice's story is tragically common in places like the rookeries of London, where life is short and brutal. Street children like her are easy prey for the gangs who control the slums with intimidation and violence. These gangs lure impressionable youths into a life of iniquity with the promise of food and belonging. Most end up as lookouts, thieves, or worse. Few survive to adulthood. The slums also attract others fleeing a dark past or ill reputation. Scoundrels, debtors, and fallen women mingle in the seedy taverns and brothels where silver quickly changes grubby hands and secrets are traded in whispers. It's a precarious existence, but for some, the anonymity and opportunities of the city underworld are preferable to a life of servitude and drudgery. Take, for example, the character of Duel Fletcher. Once a respectable cloth merchant, Duel's fortunes took a turn for the worse when he defaulted on a loan to a powerful guildmaster. With his name blackened and guards sent to seize his assets, Duel gathered what coin he could and melted into the rookeries. Using his mercantile cunning, he allied himself with one of the slum's most feared crime bosses. Duel fences stolen goods, forges documents, and extends usurious loans to other desperate souls. Though he's lost his lofty place in society, Duel relishes his new role as a big fish in this small, muddy pond. At night, he drinks and carouses with his newfound brethren, trying to forget the family he left behind and the man he once was. Sadly, few escape the poverty trap of the medieval slum. It's a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle that leaves no time or energy for improvement. Most inhabitants end up in the graves of paupers or hanging from the gallows. Their poignant stories are lost like tears in the rain. As we walk these harsh streets, take a moment to reflect on the resilience of the human spirit, even in the most challenging circumstances. And as you drift off to sleep in your safe, warm bed, spare a thought for those who are not so fortunate. Sweet dreams of all the trials and tribulations of medieval life. Perhaps none terrified people more than the prospect of plague. In an era without germ theory or modern medicine, these mysterious diseases struck like an invisible reaper, quickly overwhelming any attempts to treat or contain them. The most notorious of these was the Black Death, a pandemic of bubonic plague that ravaged Europe in the 14th century. Its cause, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, was unknown at the time. To fearful medieval minds, it seemed a curse from God himself. The plague first took hold in squalid port cities like Genoa and Marseilles, arriving on ships from the east. These bustling trade hubs, with their cramped quarters and poor sanitation, were ideal breeding grounds for the contagion. Imagine the terror that gripped the citizens as their neighbors began falling ill with alarming speed. It started with fever and chills, but soon the victims' lymph nodes swelled into painful boils. Their skin blackened with gangrene, blood pooling under the surface. In the final stages, delirious sufferers coughed up mouthfuls of blood as their internal organs liquefied. The disease tore through families and communities like wildfire. So virulent was the plague that a person could be in perfect health at daybreak and be buried in the plague pits by nightfall. As the body count mounted, panic set in. People shuttered their doors and shunned the sick. Faith in government and the church wavered as prayers went unanswered. Social order unraveled as fear and self-preservation overshadowed all other concerns. The plague stalked the almshouses and rookeries, where the poor huddled in squalor, but it also crept into the mansions and counting rooms of the wealthy. None were immune to its icy grip. At the height of the epidemic, death carts piled high with rigid corpses trundled through the empty streets day and night, their stench of decay hanging thick in the air. As the plague burned itself out over several brutal years, it left a permanently changed world in its wake. Some towns lost more than half their inhabitants, fields went unharvested, crafts and trade ground to a halt, and labor shortages caused wages to rise, shifting the balance of power between nobles and peasants. The Catholic Church, whose clergy were particularly hard hit, lost much of its aura of divine authority. Medieval people had no way of knowing it at the time, but the societal upheaval caused by the Black Death sowed the seeds that would ultimately sprout into the Renaissance and Reformation. Fewer workers meant more bargaining power for the common man, and a crisis of faith opened the door to new philosophies and a rethinking of old hierarchies. Although the plague outbreaks of the Middle Ages had mortality rates that seem apocalyptic to us today, They also spurred advances in public health and scientific thinking that laid the groundwork for our modern understanding of infectious disease. So, as you rest easy tonight, give thanks for the medical researchers and healthcare workers who work tirelessly to keep such pestilences at bay. Sleep well. As harrowing as life could be within city walls, existence was often even more precarious on the untamed frontiers of the medieval world. Far from the protection and support of large settlements, hardy folk eked out a living in remote places where the line between civilization and wilderness blurred. Some of the bleakest frontier outposts were the isolated monasteries that dotted the fringes of Europe. Perched on windswept crags or nestled in dense forests, these communities of monks sought to escape the sinful distractions of secular society and contemplate the divine through lives of asceticism and self-denial. Imagine a solitary stone monastery clinging to a cliff high above a churning northern sea. Established by a breakaway religious order seeking purity through hardship, its handful of gay-road brothers endure a daily battle against the elements just to survive. Lashed by icy rain and hail, the monastery struggles to grow in its rocky soil. Besides hardy root vegetables and sour apples, the monks rely on a small flock of ill-tempered goats for milk and cheese, supplementing their meager diet with whatever tough, oily fish they can catch from the waves. Hunger is a constant companion. When they're not working in the gardens or repairing storm-damaged buildings, the brothers spend long hours in compulsory prayer and sleep, denied even the small comforts of laughter, song, or a warm fire. At night they retire, shivering to their damp cells, to sleep on thin pallets, wrapped only in their coarse woolen robes. No one feels the weight of this joyless existence more than Brother Adaman. As a young man, Adaman committed a shameful sin of the flesh, leading to his disownment by his noble family. He was sent to this remote monastery to cleanse his soul through a life of penitence. Now in his 50th year, with an aching back and hands worn by toil and arthritis, Adaman grapples with his decision to take holy vows. Was trading fleshly pleasures for spiritual purity truly worth a lifetime of cold solitude and ceaseless labor? He wrestles with anger at the zealous abbot who drives the brothers mercilessly, and doubts about a God who would consign his servants to such a punishing life. As he lies in his smoky, draughty cell, listening to the mournful wind, Adaman finds solace in the knowledge that he will soon meet his Maker and uncover the ultimate truth. He prays that his sacrifices will have been worthwhile in the end. Reflect on how alone and insignificant one man can feel when pitted against the vast, uncaring forces of nature and the cruel austerity of religious fervor. As you slip into the forgiving softness of your bed, be thankful for the earthly comforts that people like Adaman chose to reject in their single-minded pursuit of divine grace. May you be blessed with a deep and peaceful rest. Let's rejoin our lowly foot soldier, cold and hungry, huddled in his damp tent. Night has fallen over the siege camp, but the noxious smells and constant coughing ensure an uneasy rest. He can't escape the heavy sense that something terrible is brewing beyond the shadowy canvas walls. This weary soul is not alone in his nocturnal worries. Across the land, in farms, hovels, keeps, and camps, medieval folk are undoubtedly also lying awake, trying to will themselves to sleep despite the gnawing anxieties that come with this harsh and unforgiving age. They may vary by circumstance, but their common theme is dread. For what terrors may emerge with the dawn's light? In the pitch-black dungeons, emaciated prisoners listen intently to the scurrying of rats, wondering if sleep will bring relief, or if they will join the cell's former occupants, now reduced to brittle piles in the fetid corners. Pangs of hunger twist their innards, as if the jailer's aim is as much to starve the body as to break the spirit. High above in the Lord's chamber, even the nobility, wrapped in furs and feasting on capons, find their slumber uneasy. For it is they who must maintain order in these lawless times, quelling peasant revolts, fending off inquisitive neighbors, and keeping in the good graces of their superiors, lest they be supplanted. It appears that the higher the seat, the more precarious the perch. Meanwhile, the devout monks chant their pre-dawn prayers, seeking divine mercy and guidance through the arduous litany of privations, meager rations, chronic illnesses, and the ever-present temptation of sin. Their devotion may provide some solace, but it offers little protection against the mortal perils of the age. After all, regardless of rank or race, whether noble or humble, the people of the Middle Ages rarely find true rest. The comfort of safety is so rare as to be almost unknown. Consider how in our modern age we are mercifully shielded from the worst of these ubiquitous threats. We relish a warm bed, a satisfied belly, and a secure door. We need not constantly look over our shoulder or barricade the shutters at night. Sleep can be savored as it should, a restorative respite and a nightly escape from worldly concerns. So let us cherish this most basic yet precious of comforts as we drift off to a happy, healthy slumber. We can rest easy, knowing that when we wake, we will not return to a feudal landscape of poverty and peril, but to a world of possibilities, a new day that we can aspire to fill with purpose and perhaps even moments of peace. The next time sleep proves elusive, we might reflect on those distant souls in their dark medieval nights who would envy us immensely this simple pleasure. May that gratitude guide us gently into grateful dreams as we whisper a thankful prayer across time for our tremendously good fortune. And so, we conclude our journey into some of history's harsher realms. I hope you found it an enjoyable and enlightening exploration. With any luck, you're now inspired to delve even deeper into the endlessly captivating drama of human civilization. Or at the very least, primed for a sound and satisfying slumber. Until our next foray into the folds of history, I bid you the sweetest of dreams. And if you've enjoyed our time together, I would so appreciate it if you liked this video and subscribe to the channel so that we may embark on many more adventures to come. Thank you so much for accompanying me on this passage to the past. Good night, sleep tight, and remember to count your blessings, historical and otherwise. Farewell for now, my dear Chronauts.